So apparently Brandon Sutter is really popular amongst trade talks, and among hearing that, my first immediate reaction was, wait, then why is he still on the team? But the more I think about it, the more I actually start to realize the value that Brandon Sutter brings to any team, really. It's just the fact that he was on the Vancouver Canucks that really did make people not be too fond of him. According to Jason Botchford on Twitter, the Canucks have had like 4 teams call on Brandon Sutter. Sutter is the guy that has had the most calls on this offseason, and that shows you that there is a lot of teams that needs a center. And obviously, that's kind of obvious. Centers are guys who teams value, and the Vancouver Canucks, interestingly enough, going after apparently, well, at least unsurprisingly, according to Bob McKenzie, going after Ryan O'Reilly, another center, winger kind of player. Apparently we're shopping Sutter, and apparently he's very high valued amongst other teams. And this is kind of weird. A lot of Vancouver Canucks fans are going to be like, wait, why? Why is he so valuable? And basically, it comes down to everything he's done this past season. Now, don't get me wrong. Brandon Sutter wasn't necessarily all too impressive of a player. 26 points, 11 goals, and 61 games played. If you do the math, you do 26 divided by 61, multiply that by 82. Brandon Sutter was on pace for 35 points in an 82-game season. That's really not that good. And in fact, a lot of people would say that that is terrible for a player making $4.375 million a year. Of course, that Sutter contract is something that people like to bring up, and it is a detriment, apparently, in terms of how people view the player. But in terms of the things that Brandon Sutter was able to do, the fact that he was arguably one of the most relied upon centers in a defensive penalty-killing role in the league, basically, is certainly noteworthy. It's very interesting to note that he actually finished as a +8. He was one of the top guys on the team in terms of plus-minus, and he overwhelmingly was a guy who was used in the most defensive positions. In fact, he had the record this season for most penalty kill minutes per game out of every single player. Brandon Sutter is a guy who, let's face it, we've been starting to utilize him in a way that let's face it, he's supposed to be utilized. Because Sutter is a defensive guy. He's not necessarily a two-way guy, in my opinion. I don't really think he's all too good at offense. I mean, 11 goals, 61 games played, okay, that's fair. But at the same time, he's a guy who primarily relies on defense to carry him through his minutes. And that's definitely what he's been doing. The fact that he was a +8 on this team, in a position where he was used so frequently in the defensive side of things, it's honestly incredible how Brandon Sutter isn't a -30, but at the same time, it's very interesting to note, because Sutter did play on the Canucks. The Canucks were bad defensively this season, and Sutter didn't necessarily get that many points as well. Sutter is legitimately, statistically speaking, a player who is good to have out there in defensive situations. He's a player who, by the numbers, has a statistical advantage over his teammates in terms of things like Corsi and all that other stuff. So it doesn't really surprise me, thinking about it a little bit further, that teams want Sutter. And there's apparently been 4+ teams who have called for Brandon Sutter, and this is really interesting because in my mind, the first thing that pops up to me upon thinking about this is, what's he worth? What would a team be willing to give up for a guy who is arguably the perfect third-line center, a guy who can't really put up too many points, but can contribute offensively once in a while, not once in a blue moon, but just once in an occasional while, and a guy who's reliable defensively. I'm gonna say it, he's reliable defensively. Sutter and Eriksson, for some reason, I liked having them both on the PK. I think they both did really good jobs. Sutter works really hard as well, but what would other teams be willing to give up for a Sutter? Second? A third? A first, maybe? No, definitely not a first, but it's honestly kind of a difficult label to label for this to me, and I don't have a basis on what I think teams would want to give up for a Brandon Sutter. For a draft pick, maybe I'm capping things off at a second, but for a prospect or a young guy, I don't know what I'm thinking. Maybe just like a top 6 forward potential guy, maybe just a top 9 guy who works hard. There's really no telling as to this, and upon thinking about this, upon realizing this, that I don't really have my own labels, it kind of sparks the question as to where is he going to go, even? If he does get traded, who does he go to, and what do we get back? Because I just don't know how Jim Benning would be willing to pull the trigger on a Brandon Sutter trade upon noting how valuable he is to the Canucks. And I'm not going to sit here and say that Sutter was an absolute trash, sucky player last season, because I don't think he was. I think he was a solid player who actually did his job. Sure, he wasn't offensively gifted as, let's say, a Brock Besser, a Horvat, or a Sedin twin, but for his role, Brandon Sutter does a really good job at it. And now I'm starting to understand why teams want him. It's just the question of what we're getting back, and the likelihood, to be honest, of Jim Benning being willing to make a trade like this. Because Benning, I don't know if he's going to be a guy who will settle for something weak for a Brandon Sutter. I know he settled for something weak with a Thomas Vanek, but it's a completely different situation here. Vanek was one-dimensional. He could only play offense, no defense, and he had a reputation of disappearing in the playoffs. Meanwhile, Brandon Sutter has been defensively sound the entire season, basically. And what if we got rid of Brandon Sutter? If we get Brandon Sutter out, does that mean that we're definitely 100% grabbing an O'Reilly? Because I don't want Sutter to leave and to get nothing back. I don't think Adam Gaudette or Tyler Mott is ready for that top 6 center role. Pettersson, probably, I don't know how things are going to play out with him in terms of the lineup, but I want to have a backup plan. I don't want to rely on a guy who's in his first year of the NHL. Nor do I want to rely on a guy who we got back in a Thomas Vanek trade. Nor do I want to rely on a guy who, again, is in his first year in the NHL in Adam Gaudette. I want a second-line center who has been in the NHL for a few years. Sutter, yes, he fits that. Gagne, I honestly would rather have Gagne on the wing. Same thing with Grenlin, but, I guess. It's just that I don't feel comfortable with that, you know? I'd want a Horvat, Sutter kind of top 2 center pairing before relying on the guys like Gaudette and Pettersson and Mott and whatnot. So, if we get rid of Sutter, we need to bring in an O'Reilly, don't we? We need to bring in a guy who could replace everything that Sutter has done, defensively, penalty-killing-wise, and the guy who will basically be our ox on the penalty kill. Because Sutter was so important to us defensively, and I know I'm kind of gushing over in a way that makes it seem like I really like him and he's my favorite player ever, but believe me, when I first heard about this, I was like, why is Sutter still here? He should probably get traded because we could get some stuff for him, but it really did take a little bit of research to just acknowledge the fact that Sutter is an effective player in his role. I'm not going to say a good player. I'm going to say an effective player. Because everything that we relied on Sutter to do, he did well. It's just that he didn't get a lot of points. Which, you know, that totally is a deal breaker for some people, but for the majority of people looking at the statistics of defensive sides and penalty killing, Sutter is a good player. Hands down. And I know the contract sucks. Let's face it, I don't think we should be paying a guy whose basic main purpose on the team is to be defensively sound and lead the penalty kill over $4 million, but that's the way things are. And if teams are honestly willing to soak up that contract, well, I'm all for it, to be honest. Let him have it. Let him have Brandon Sutter. If he goes back to Carolina in a deal involving the 7th overall pick and we get back like Hannafin and something else or something, okay, I'd be willing to see how that turns out. But for the most part, Sutter is a very interesting player. Because he didn't do what a lot of people expected him to do, and instead he was placed into a completely different role by the coach that he was entrusted with, and he succeeded in these conditions. He was a +8, and he had so many defensive zone faceoffs and penalty killing times and everything. He was just such a good, reliable player to have on your defensive end. Not gonna say a good player in terms of offense, because a lot of people recognize Sutter's offensive talent and realize that it's not really there. In accordance, at least, with the guys like Berchi, Horvat, etc. We have better options on offense, but you can't really go wrong with Brandon Sutter for the defensive side of things. Which is why I would really like to get O'Reilly if Sutter gets traded. Because O'Reilly could sort of replace Sutter in terms of that defensive center type role. That's just my thoughts on it, though, because really, you guys have your own opinions. You guys can comment down below what you think of Brandon Sutter. Should he get traded? Should he not? Who would you like to see him go to? Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you're plus, that's just Gaming, and bye.